Each night, a lynx crept into the nursery and hissed at the baby. When the parents uncovered the reason, they couldn't believe their eyes. Henry Stevens wasn't a man who liked change, but every morning the thought crept in. Maybe today's the day I call it quits. At 64 years old, retirement was a word he heard more often than he cared to admit. His old army buddies had long since hung up their hats, trading work boots for porch swings and long vacations. They teased him about it, swapping stories of lazy afternoons with grandkids or the freedom of not setting alarms. Sometimes their words made him wonder if he was holding on too tightly. But then he'd settle into his worn leather chair, its cracks resembling the forest trails he knew like the back of his hand, and let the thought pass. The truth was he couldn't imagine leaving. What would he do with himself? For Henry, the forest wasn't just a job. It was everything. Since leaving the army, he'd spent decades patrolling these woods, tending trails, watching over wildlife, and protecting the land from poachers and other threats. Being a ranger wasn't just his work, it was who he was. This forest, with its towering trees and whispering leaves, held his past, his purpose, and his place in the world. Retirement might beckon like a distant shore, but Henry wasn't ready to leave home. Not yet. And purpose was hard to come by, especially since Martha. He glanced at the faded photograph on his desk. His wife, Martha, stood with her arms crossed, a mischievous grin lighting up her face. Even though the photo had yellowed with age, her eyes seemed as alive as the day he'd met her. He couldn't help but smile at the memory, though it was bittersweet. It was in this forest, more than 40 years ago, that he'd met her, the woman who changed his life. Back then, Henry was in his early 20s, freshly discharged from the army and eager to prove himself as a ranger in this small, sleepy Appalachian town. The job was challenging and lonely at times, but the solitude suited him. That summer, however, his routine was disrupted in the most unexpected way. Martha, she wasn't a local. She was a city girl, born and bred, visiting her grandmother for the season. Her grandmother lived in a weathered old house just outside the forest, the kind of place where creaking floorboards and the scent of wood smoke told stories of generations past. Martha had reluctantly agreed to visit, hoping to escape the bustle of city life. Instead, she found herself face to face with rural quiet, and she hated it, at least at first. One sticky, sun-drenched afternoon, she decided to go mushroom hunting. She wasn't much of a forager, but her grandmother had always spoken of the joys of wandering the woods, basket in hand. Martha thought it sounded quaint and adventurous. It wasn't. By the time Henry found her, she was sitting on a mossy log, her face streaked with tears, her wicker basket tossed aside and forgotten. She looked like a figure from a fairy tale, her dark curls wild around her face, her eyes rimmed red from crying. Her floral dress clung to her knees where she'd been sitting in the damp forest floor. Henry had been walking his usual route, eyes scanning the treetops for signs of nesting hawks, when he heard her soft sniffles. He paused, listening. It wasn't unusual to encounter lost hikers, but there was something so raw, so human about the sound that it tugged at him. When he finally stepped into view, she gasped and looked up, startled. "Hey there," he said gently, tilting his ranger hat back. His voice was low and calm, the kind you'd trust even if you weren't sure you should. "Looks like you could use a hand." She blinked at him, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something but couldn't quite manage it. Instead, she nodded. "Lost?" She nodded again, this time with a shaky breath. "All right," Henry said, crouching slightly so they were at eye level. "No need to worry. Happens all the time. How about we get you back on the trail?" I don't know which way," she stammered, her voice breaking. "Well, lucky for you, I do," he replied with a reassuring smile. "I'm Henry. What's your name?" "Martha," she whispered. "Martha," he repeated. "Nice to meet you. You mind if I carry that basket for you?" She hesitated, but eventually handed it to him. It was nearly empty, save for a few wilted ferns and a mushroom that looked more poisonous than edible. "This all you found?" he teased lightly, trying to ease her nerves. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted with a weak laugh, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Not much of a forager, huh?" "Not much of a woods person, period," she said, a hint of her true personality shining through. "Well," Henry said, extending a hand to help her up, "I guess I'll just have to be your guide." That was the beginning. It wasn't long before their paths crossed again, first by chance, then by intention. By the end of the summer, Martha had changed her mind about the forest and about Henry. That chance meeting turned into something much more. Martha never went back to the city, and the forest that had terrified her that afternoon became a second home. Over the next year, she and Henry fell deeply in love, and within 2 years they were married in a simple ceremony under the canopy of trees. It wasn't extravagant, just the way they liked it. The only guests were a few close friends, her grandmother, and some curious deer watching from the distance. A few years later, their daughter Lily was born. She was sharp and ambitious, always with a book in hand or a notebook filled with scribbles. By the time she was a teenager, it was clear she was destined for something more than their little town could offer. "Are you sure about this, kiddo?" Henry had asked the night before she left for college. He stood by the car trying to keep his voice steady as Martha packed snacks for the trip. "Yes, Dad," Lily said with a smile, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I'll come back to visit all the time, I promise." True to her word, she did. Even after she graduated from a prestigious college in New York City, landed a high-powered job at a law firm, and eventually married, Lily made time for her parents. Thanksgiving dinners, surprise visits, phone calls late into the night, she never let the distance diminish their bond. Life had been good, until Martha started losing weight, complaining of headaches that wouldn't go away. She brushed it off as stress, even though Henry begged her to see a doctor. "I'm fine," she'd insisted, brushing a hand through her still thick curls. "Just need to slow down a bit, that's all." But slowing down didn't help. By the time she finally relented and went to the clinic, the news was grim. A tumor. Martha faced her diagnosis with the kind of quiet grace that Henry had always admired. She spent her remaining months in the house they had made their home, sitting on the porch in the afternoons and watching the sunlight filter through the trees. Lily visited as often as she could, her voice breaking as she read her mother's favourite books aloud. "I'm not afraid, Henry," Martha told him one night as they lay in bed, her voice barely a whisper. "I just wish I had more time. For you. For Lily." Henry didn't reply. He couldn't. His throat burned with unsaid words, and his tears soaked the pillowcase as he held her close. The months after her passing were a haze for Henry. Lily begged him to move in with her, but he refused. How could he leave the home he and Martha had built together? Or the forest that had been his sanctuary, the place where his soul felt alive? And so he stayed. The forest in its quiet and constancy soothed him. It brought him peace. That fateful morning, like so many others, Henry stepped out of his modest cabin, the porch creaking beneath his boots. The rising sun cast a golden glow over the treetops, igniting the forest in hues of amber and green. A warm breeze carried the songs of birds, mingling with the earthy scent of pine and wildflowers. It was the kind of morning that usually filled Henry with a sense of peace, but today there was unease in the air. "Gonna be a good day," he muttered to himself, though the weight in his chest suggested otherwise. He climbed into his old truck, its engine sputtering to life after a reluctant groan. He had some investigating to do. 2 days earlier, a local boy had come running into town, breathless from picking berries near one of the remote trails. He'd spotted a sleek black SUV parked off the dirt road, hidden among the trees. The boy insisted it wasn't anyone from the community. Henry knew most of the folks in the area and their vehicles, and this one didn't fit. Black SUVs usually meant trouble, poachers, land surveyors, or worse. Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He'd seen enough in his time to trust his gut. Whatever was out there, it was his job to check it out. The dirt road leading to the clearing was rough, overgrown in places and full of jarring bumps that rattled the old truck. The forest seemed to close in around him as the road narrowed, the sunlight filtering through in thin golden beams. To most, these woods might seem oppressive, but not to Henry. He loved their quiet strength, their ancient wisdom. Noisy, crowded cities had never appealed to him. Appalachia, with its rolling hills, whispering streams, and endless green, was home. After about an hour, he reached the clearing. He killed the engine and stepped out, boots crunching softly on the dirt. The area seemed undisturbed. No SUV, no tire tracks, no signs of recent activity. False alarm? He murmured to himself, scanning the tree line. The forest was still, save for the occasional chirp of birds or rustle of leaves in the breeze. Just as Henry was about to turn back, a faint sound reached his ears. It was subtle at first, almost drowned out by the forest's natural symphony. But then it came again, a low, mournful noise, somewhere between a whimper and a cry. Henry froze, every muscle tensing. His hand instinctively went to the shotgun slung over his shoulder. The sound was coming from deeper in the woods. Moving cautiously, he followed the noise, his boots crunching softly against the underbrush. The forest seemed to grow quieter with every step, as if holding its breath. Then he saw it. A lynx. It was a magnificent creature, larger than most Henry had encountered in these parts. Its tawny fur, marked with faint rosettes, glistened with sweat. Its tufted ears drooped, and its amber eyes, usually fierce and watchful, were now dulled with pain. The lynx's front paw was caught in a steel trap, the cruel metal jaws clamped tight around its leg. Blood had soaked into the dirt where the animal had thrashed in vain, trying to free itself. Henry's jaw clenched. "Damn poachers," he muttered under his breath. Steel traps were illegal in these woods, their use banned for the very suffering he was now witnessing. Whoever had set this one had no intention of returning for it, or its victim. The lynx lifted its head weakly as Henry approached, its gaze meeting his. For a moment, man and animal regarded each other in silence. There was no fear in the lynx's eyes, only a weary resignation, as if it understood this was the end. But then, something shifted. The lynx's ears twitched, and its gaze darted toward a nearby thicket. Henry followed its line of sight, his breath catching when he saw it. A tiny figure trembling among the shadows. A lynx cub. No older than a few weeks, the cub was barely more than a bundle of fur, its wide, frightened eyes fixed on Henry. It stayed perfectly still, obeying the silent command of its mother to remain hidden. Henry lowered his shotgun, his heart sinking at the sight of the cub. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. The cub, its tiny body quivering, let out a faint mewling sound, a heartbreaking plea that pierced the stillness of the forest. Henry turned his attention back to the mother lynx. Her amber eyes held his, filled with a desperate kind of defiance. Despite her pain, she wasn't done fighting. Not for herself, but for the cub. "All right, Mama," Henry said softly, his voice steady but kind. "Looks like you've got a reason to stick around. Let's see what we can do." The lynx barely moved as Henry approached. It was too weak to fight, though its lips pulled back in a feeble snarl, exposing sharp but useless teeth. Its amber eyes flickered with fear and pain. But there was something else there too, a flicker of defiance, of resilience. "Easy now," Henry murmured, his voice low and steady, the same tone he used with frightened animals and skittish recruits back in his army days. He knelt beside the creature, his joints creaking in protest. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" The steel trap was a cruel thing, rusted and jagged, its jaws biting deep into the lynx's front leg. Blood had clotted around the wound, but it was clear the injury was severe, likely a broken bone. Henry ran a hand lightly over the lynx's paw, feeling the tremble of muscles locked in pain. The lynx growled faintly, a pitiful sound that barely broke the forest's silence. "Yeah, I know it hurts," Henry said softly, his weathered hands reaching for the trap. "Don't you worry now. We'll get you out of this." The lynx flinched as his hands touched the metal, her body tensing as if bracing for another blow. Henry worked quickly but carefully, his fingers steady despite the rage simmering in his chest. Poachers. He'd seen the damage they could do, the suffering they left in their wake, but it never got easier. "Just a few more seconds," he said, gritting his teeth as he fought the rusted mechanism, his gloves strained against the sharp edges, the effort making his arms ache. "Come on, you stubborn piece of junk!" With a loud snap, the trap finally gave way, and the steel jaws released their cruel grip. The lynx collapsed onto the grass, her body shuddering with exhaustion, blood pooling beneath her injured leg. For a moment, Henry just sat back on his heels, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "There you go," he said, his voice soft. "You're free now, Mama." Before he could do anything else, the lynx cub darted out from the thicket, its tiny legs stumbling over the uneven ground. It reached its mother and nuzzled against her side, letting out tiny, pitiful cries. The mother lynx, though clearly weakened, turned her head and licked the cub's fur with slow, deliberate strokes. Henry smiled, the sight easing some of the tension in his chest. "Family's family, huh?" he muttered, watching the tender exchange. Even in her pain, the mother's first instinct was to comfort her young. Reaching for the first aid kit he always kept in his truck, Henry returned to the lynx's side. "All right, let's clean you up a bit," he said, pulling out a bottle of antiseptic and some gauze. The mother lynx let out a faint growl as he approached, her ears twitching in warning. "Now don't start with me," Henry said, shaking his head. "You can't scare me off, you know. I've dealt with meaner critters than you, and I didn't back down from them either." The lynx seemed to regard him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. Then, as if realizing she had no strength left to argue, she rested her head on the ground. Henry worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best he could and wrapping it with gauze to slow the bleeding. It wasn't perfect, but it would do for now. As he worked, the cub climbed onto its mother's side, mewing softly. Henry glanced at it and chuckled. "Your baby's hungry," he said, feigning sternness at the injured lynx. "And here you are, just lying there." The lynx huffed, her breath stirring the grass beneath her. Henry softened, his voice turning gentle. "Don't worry, Mama. We'll get you home, fix you up, and make sure everyone's fed. You'll see, it's all going to be okay." But deep down, Henry knew the odds were against her. The injury was severe, and infections were a constant threat. Without proper care, she wouldn't make it. And the cub? Alone in the wild? It didn't stand a chance. Henry sat back, his knees protesting after kneeling so long. He glanced at the pair, the cub now curled up against its mother's side, its tiny body trembling with exhaustion. The sight tugged at something deep within him, a memory maybe, of how fiercely Martha had cared for Lily when she was little. No matter what life threw at them, Martha had always found a way to protect their family. "All right," he said, his voice firmer now. "You're coming with me." He'd already made up his mind. Leaving the lynx here, injured and vulnerable, wasn't an option. He couldn't just walk away, not with that cub depending on her. He'd bring them back to his barn. Nothing fancy, but it would be safe and dry. He had enough supplies to tend to her wounds properly, and the cub could stay close to its mother while she healed. Getting them there, though, would be the tricky part. Henry scratched his beard, thinking. The lynx couldn't walk, and carrying her would be dangerous, even in her weakened state. He'd need to improvise. "Stay put," he said, standing and heading back toward his truck. "I'll be right back." The mother lynx watched him go, her amber eyes still wary but no longer panicked. As Henry rummaged through the back of his truck, pulling out an old tarp and some rope, he thought about what lay ahead. Nursing a wild animal back to health was no small task, but if anyone could do it, it was him. The ride back to the village was a spectacle in itself. Henry had carefully tucked the injured Lynx into the passenger seat, her wounded leg wrapped in gauze, and draped an old tarp over her to keep her calm. Her tufted ears occasionally twitched free of the cover, her sharp features peeking out just enough to give passers-by a good fright. As Henry pulled into his driveway, his neighbour Mike leaned over the fence, wiping grease from his hands onto his overalls. "Hey, Henry," he called out, squinting. "What in the world you got there? That thing dead?" "Dead?" Henry shot back, climbing out of the truck and raising an eyebrow. "Not a chance. She's alive, but she's been through hell. And look, she's got a little one too." He reached into his backpack and pulled out the cub, cradling the tiny, trembling creature in his hands. The cub whimpered softly, blinking at the bright sunlight and squirming closer to Henry's chest. Mike whistled low, shaking his head. "What are you going to do with them? You sure it wouldn't be kinder to you know?" He made a cut. "That fur would fetch a nice price, you know." Henry's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he stepped closer to Mike. "Get out of here, Mike," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Or I'll see what your hide's worth." Mike backed off, holding up his hands defensively. All right. No need to bite my head off, but seriously, Henry, how are you going to feed that little thing? Looks like it's barely weaned." "I'll figure it out," Henry snapped, his patience worn thin. "Without your help, thanks very much." Mike muttered something under his breath and shuffled back toward his garage, leaving Henry alone with his new charges. He glanced down at the mother lynx, who had shifted slightly under the tarp but was still too weak to move much. "Don't worry, girl," he said softly. "We'll get you fixed up. And you," he added, looking at the cub, who had nuzzled into the crook of his arm, "you'll make it too. I'll see to it." In the barn, Henry worked quickly to prepare a makeshift home for the Lynx family. He layered straw into one corner, creating a soft, insulated nest. Gently, he settled the mother lynx into the straw, her body limp but her eyes still sharp as she watched him, with a mixture of exhaustion and mistrust. "You're not dying," Henry muttered as he adjusted the straw around her. "Not after all the trouble I went through getting you out of that trap. And you," he glanced at the cub who had curled tightly against his mother's side, "you'd better stick around too. I didn't scrape my hands bloody in that brush for nothing." The next few weeks tested every ounce of Henry's patience and resolve. The mother lynx's wounds, deep and jagged, became infected despite his best efforts. Her fever climbed relentlessly, and her breathing grew shallow. Henry spent hours in the barn, applying poultices, cleaning her wounds, and coaxing her to drink water. The cub, meanwhile, was a challenge of its own. It refused the milk he offered, turning its nose up at everything. Henry tried cow's milk, goat's milk, even cream, but the cub remained stubborn, its cries growing weaker with each passing day. One afternoon, when the local vet came by to check on the lynx, her prognosis was grim. "She's suffering, Henry," the vet said, her voice gentle but firm. "I know you mean well, but there's no sense prolonging it. Putting her down would be kinder." Henry's face darkened, and he let loose a string of expletives that sent the vet retreating with her bag in hand. "She's not done yet," he growled after her, "and neither am I." That night, Henry's phone rang. It was Lily, calling from New York City, her voice cheerful despite the late hour. "Dad," she said, "what's this I hear about you playing nursemaid to a lynx? You're going to be the talk of the town." Henry chuckled, though his exhaustion seeped through the line. "It's no joke, kiddo. She's in rough shape, and that cub's barely hanging on. I've tried everything, but I'm at my wit's end." Lily didn't miss a beat. "Let me ask around," she said. "We've got amazing vets at the zoo here. If anyone knows how to help, it's them." True to her word, Lily called back the next day with advice from the zoo's wildlife specialists. They recommended a specific antibiotic for the mother lynx and a high-calorie formula for the cub. Tracking down the supplies wasn't easy. Henry had to make a trip to the nearest town and scour half a dozen stores, but when he returned to the barn that evening, he was armed and ready. The results were slow but steady. The antibiotics began to take effect, and the mother lynx's fever finally broke. Her wounds, though still tender, started to heal. The cub took to the special formula eagerly, its strength returning day by day. By the end of the summer, the Lynx family was a far cry from the pitiful sight Henry had rescued. The mother, though still wary, allowed Henry to approach without growling. Her leg, while mending, would likely leave a permanent limp, but she could stand and move around the barn. The cub, meanwhile, had transformed into a playful ball of mischief. It scampered around the barn, climbing hay bales and pouncing on imaginary prey. Henry often found himself laughing despite the chaos, marveling at the resilience of these creatures. One crisp autumn morning, Henry trudged to the barn with breakfast in hand, a bucket of fresh water and a plate of scraps for the cub, along with a slab of venison he'd saved for the mother lynx. But as he pushed open the door, he stopped short. The barn was empty. The straw nest in the corner, once warm with the lynx and her cub's presence, now lay cold and undisturbed. The only sound was the creak of the barn door in the breeze. Henry scanned the corners, half expecting the cub to come bounding out from some hiding spot, but there was nothing. Gone. Standing in the doorway, he sighed deeply and glanced down at his old dog, Max, who sat beside him, wagging his tail lazily. Max had been keeping a wary eye on the Lynx family for weeks, always ready to sound the alarm if they wandered too close to his patch of territory. "They've moved on, buddy," Henry said, his voice soft but steady. A bittersweet smile tugged at his lips. "That's good. Means they're strong enough to make it." Max tilted his head as if considering this, then stretched out on the frosty ground, clearly relieved. The barn, and the yard, was his again. Henry lingered in the doorway for a moment longer, gazing into the forest beyond. The autumn leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the trees bare and skeletal against the grey sky. Somewhere out there, the lynx and her cub were finding their way. That thought warmed him, even as a chill wind bit through his jacket. "Good luck out there, Mama," he murmured, tipping his hat to the empty barn. "You've earned it." Winter arrived swiftly, blanketing Appalachia in a thick layer of snow. The forest transformed into a world of white and silence, every branch glittering with frost. Henry adapted as he always did, trading his truck for skis and making his patrols through the woods, keeping an eye out for poachers and wildlife in distress. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the forest glowed with an icy golden hue, Henry felt a prickling sensation along the back of his neck. He paused, his skis crunching softly in the snow, and glanced around. The woods were still, too still. Then he saw her. Perched on a low branch above the trail was the lynx. Her coat was thick and glossy now, the perfect camouflage against the snowy backdrop. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, locked onto his. She was a vision of strength and resilience, a far cry from the injured creature he'd nursed back to health. "Well, I'll be," Henry murmured, lowering his rifle and tugging his hat off. "It's you, my lynx, and look at you. What a beauty you've become." The lynx leapt gracefully from the branch, landing with barely a whisper of sound just a few feet away. For a long moment they regarded each other in silence. Henry marvelled at her poise, her sheer wildness. She was untouchable, yet here she was. He scanned the trees, wondering if her cub was nearby. "Where's your boy?" he asked softly. "Off on his own, I bet. Growing up, like they all do." The lynx didn't answer, of course. She simply flicked her tail, stepped closer, and then, almost imperceptibly, let out a low, rumbling purr. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a warm glow spreading through Henry's chest. Then, as silently as she had appeared, she turned and melted into the underbrush, her golden coat vanishing among the shadows. Henry stood there for a long time, his breath misting in the cold air. A smile crept across his face as he adjusted his hat. "Good luck out there, Mama," he said softly, tipping the brim before turning back toward home. The encounter stayed with Henry all winter. Occasionally he'd spot her during his patrols. A flash of movement between the trees, her golden eyes catching the light. She never came too close but always seemed to shadow him. a silent presence in the woods. Once or twice she even ventured into his yard, much to Max's dismay. The old dog would bark and growl from his spot on the porch, his hackles raised. "She's just passing through, Max," Henry would say with a chuckle. "You'll survive. She's not here for your food anyway." Max didn't seem convinced, but he tolerated the intrusions, if only because Henry clearly wasn't bothered. As the years passed, the lynx became a quiet companion in Henry's life. Though she remained wild and untouchable, she was a constant presence, appearing just often enough to remind him that she hadn't forgotten. People in the village took notice too. "Henry's got himself a new dog," one neighbour teased one day at the general store. "All that's left is to put a leash on her." "She's a cat, you fool," Henry retorted, shaking his head with a laugh. "And a free one at that. Won't let anyone touch her, not even me." "Well, if she's still hanging around you, she must like you," another said, grinning. "Wild animals don't stick around for just anyone." Henry shrugged but couldn't suppress a small smile. Deep down he felt the same. Though the lynx was wild, their bond was undeniable. One summer, Henry's daughter Lily announced she was coming for a visit. She, her husband Nick, and their 6-month-old son Andy would be making the journey. "You sure it's not too much trouble?" Henry asked over the phone. "All the way across the country with a baby? That's no small thing." Lily's laugh bubbled through the line. "Dad, it's no trouble at all. The plane will get us most of the way there, and the train ride isn't bad. Besides, you need to meet your grandson." It's about time he met his grandpa. Henry chuckled, though his voice wavered with emotion. "You're right about that. It's been too long. I can't wait to see you, Lily." When they arrived, Henry's face lit up as he opened the door to greet them. He couldn't hide his joy as he took in the sight of his grandson. Little Andy was the spitting image of Henry when he was a baby. Chubby cheeks, bright eyes, and a mischievous grin. "He's got the Stevens look, no doubt about it," Henry said proudly, lifting Andy gently into his arms. The baby gurgled, grabbing at Henry's grizzled beard, which earned a deep laugh. "Strong grip, too. This one's gonna be a heartbreaker." They settled in quickly. Andy had a small room near the kitchen, the warmest part of the house. Though it was summer, Henry insisted on sealing up any drafts for the baby. Lily and Nick took the spare bedroom, while Henry moved to the living room, giving up his usual spot without hesitation. Their days were filled with laughter and activity. Henry and Nick spent mornings fishing in the nearby stream or foraging for mushrooms in the woods, sharing stories and banter along the way. Lily, meanwhile, fussed over Andy, cooking hearty meals and ensuring the baby was always within sight. Evenings were spent under the old apple tree, sipping tea and swapping stories from their lives apart. "You were right to come," Henry said one night as the stars twinkled above them. The air was warm and the apple blossoms scented the breeze. "Feels good to have the house full again." "It feels good to be here," Lily replied, resting her head against Nick's shoulder. "I miss this place." One late evening, as they lingered in the yard after dinner, Lily suddenly frowned, her gaze drifting toward the house. "I left Andy's window open," she said. "It was so stuffy earlier. But now I'm worried. It might be drafty." Nick waved a dismissive hand. "It's hot as blazes in the house. He'll be fine. Babies are tougher than you think." "You're probably right," Lily said, though her tone was uncertain. She shifted in her chair, her fingers drumming lightly on the table. After a moment, she stood. "I'm just going to check. Won't take a minute." Henry watched her go, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Mothers and their instincts," he said, shaking his head. "Never seen anything like it." "She worries about everything," Nick replied with a chuckle, though his tone carried affection. "Can't blame her, though. First kid." Their conversation shifted to the best fishing lures for trout, Henry passionately defending his preference for spinners, when a muffled cry from inside the house cut them short. Lily appeared in the doorway moments later, her face pale as a sheet. She clutched the doorframe, her breath uneven. There's a lynx in Andy's room," she whispered. Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "I didn't see her at first, but then I saw the glow of her eyes in the dark, and the moonlight caught the tips of her ears. She's sitting right by his crib, hissing at me. Nick shot to his feet, his face draining of colour. And Andy? He's sleeping, Lily said shakily. I could hear him breathing. Henry stood, his expression hardening. Stay calm, he said, grabbing a sturdy wooden club from the corner of the porch. I'll handle it. Dad, be careful, Lily pleaded, her voice rising in panic. She might attack you, or worse, Andy. Henry gave her a reassuring nod, though his grip on the club tightened. Without another word, he stepped inside, moving with practiced care. The floor creaked beneath his boots as he approached the baby's room, the air heavy with tension. The Lynx was perched by the crib, her body taut, her ears pinned back in warning, her amber eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, locked onto Henry the moment he entered. Her sleek body radiated a mix of feral intensity and hesitation, as if she was torn between attack and retreat. Henry stopped in his tracks, lowering the club slightly. It's you, he murmured, recognition dawning as he took in the slight limp of her right paw. I should have known. For a moment they simply stared at each other. Henry's mind raced, his instincts screaming to act, but something in the lynx's gaze gave him pause. This wasn't a wild animal cornered and panicking. This was something else, something familiar. Then, as if reaching a decision, the lynx turned. With a single graceful leap, she sailed through the open window, her shadow disappearing into the night. Henry exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing as he approached the crib. Andy stirred but remained fast asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Henry glanced out the window, catching a final glimpse of the lynx disappearing into the underbrush. She remembered me, Henry whispered to himself, his grip on the club slackening. He couldn't help but feel a mix of admiration and frustration. Why did I save her back then, he wondered. Was this her way of watching over us? Or was it something else entirely? The family kept all the windows closed after that night, even in the sweltering summer heat. Lily and Nick stayed close to the house, venturing outside only into the fenced yard with Andy. The joy of their visit dimmed, overshadowed by the constant watchfulness that now permeated their days. Henry noticed Lily glancing more and more often at the calendar, counting down the days until their departure. The house, once filled with laughter, had grown tense and quiet. But as Henry stood on the porch one evening, staring into the tree line, he couldn't shake the feeling that what they feared wasn't what they should have been worrying about. One afternoon, Henry stood by the sink, the cold glass of water in his hand, half forgotten. Outside, Lily was sitting on a blanket, under the shade of the apple tree, Andy giggling as she made silly faces. Max lay nearby, dozing in the sun. It was a picture of serenity, the kind of moment Henry cherished. But the raised voice coming from the living room shattered the quiet. Henry frowned and set the glass down, wiping his hands on his jeans. Nick's voice, low and usually measured, carried an edge of urgency now. Henry moved closer, his boots silent on the worn wooden floor. No, I told you, Nick was saying, his tone sharp. We can spin this. It's about the long-term vision, not the short-term complaints. A pause then. Yes, I know it's delicate, but these people trust me. Henry's brow furrowed. These people? He stepped closer, just out of sight, and listened. Nick sighed heavily. It's just complicated. My father-in-law's a ranger, for God's sake. And now there's this lynx thing. Yeah, a wild lynx right by the crib. You can imagine how that complicates the messaging. Henry's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists. I'm working on the communication strategy, Nick continued, lowering his voice slightly. The angle has to be that the forest isn't as rich in wildlife as people think. If we prove the animals are already migrating, it'll be easier to sell the project, but listen. He hesitated. There are wild animals here. That could be a problem. I'll do my best, but you need to know it's not going to be simple. Henry stepped into the room, his face like thunder. Not going to be simple, huh? Nick spun around, his phone slipping slightly in his grip. Henry, I didn't hear you come in. Clearly, Henry said, his voice low and dangerous. Who are you talking to? Nick hesitated, glancing at the phone like it might offer an escape. Just work, he said, forcing a smile. It's nothing important. Nothing important, huh? Henry took a step closer. Sounds to me like you're working with someone trying to tear apart this forest, and from what I just heard, you're helping them do it. Nick's smile faltered. Look, it's not what you think. Oh, I think it's exactly what I heard, Henry snapped, his voice rising. A communication strategy? Proving the animals are leaving? What kind of nonsense are you selling, Nick? Nick sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not that simple, Henry. The commission I work for. Commission? You mean those corporate suits who care more about money than nature? Henry interrupted, his face reddening. Tell me something, Nick. Are the traps I've been finding out there tied to your precious company? Nick's eyes widened. What traps? Don't play dumb with me, Henry growled. The steel traps, the ones that mangled that lynx's paw. Are those bastards behind it? Nick shook his head vehemently. I don't know anything about traps, Henry, I swear. But, he hesitated, his voice dropping. This company usually gets what it wants. That's not good news for the forest. Henry's heart sank, but his anger didn't abate. So you knew what they were about, and you still came here, bringing my daughter and grandson into it. What the hell were you thinking, Nick? Nick opened his mouth to reply, but a voice from behind them cut him off. What's going on? Both men turned to see Lily standing in the doorway, Andy perched on her hip. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of confusion and worry. Henry gestured toward Nick, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. Why don't you tell her, Nick? Tell her why you're really here. Henry, Nick began, but Lily's sharp voice cut through the room. Nick, what is he talking about? Nick hesitated, his eyes darting between his wife and father-in-law. It's work. The commission I'm with. The commission that's trying to destroy this forest, Henry exploded. Your husband's working with a company trying to prove there's no wildlife here so they can tear it all up for their precious metals. Lily's face darkened, her grip tightening on Andy. Nick, please tell me this isn't true. Nick took a deep breath. I didn't know it would be this serious, Lily, I swear. When I took the job, it was just PR work, strategy and messaging. I didn't realize how far they'd go until recently. Lily's eyes filled with tears. So that's why you wanted us to come here? To scope out the area for your work? No, that's not. Nick paused, guilt flashing across his face. Okay, maybe it was part of it at first. But I thought it wouldn't be this bad. Lily shook her head, her voice rising. You lied to me, Nick. And worse, you're lying to yourself if you think this is okay. Nick's own frustration bubbled over. And what about the lynx, Lily? He shouted. It was in our son's room, hissing like it was ready to attack. Is that what you want to protect? Dangerous animals that could hurt Andy? Enough! Henry roared, his voice echoing in the room. Don't you dare twist this around to justify destroying nature. That lynx was only in there because you people are driving them out of their habitats with your greed. Nick ran a hand over his face, his shoulders slumping. What good are wild animals, Henry? What good is a forest if it's full of things that can kill people? Maybe it's better to let progress take its course. Henry's eyes burned with fury. What good are they? They're everything, Nick. They keep this land alive. They keep us alive. You may not care about that, but I'll be damned if I let you or your company destroy what's left of it. Nick looked away, his voice barely audible. They won't stop, Henry. This company, they don't take no for an answer. Well, neither do I, Henry said firmly. I'm going to the local community with this. They'll know what you're up to and they'll fight back. The room fell into a tense silence, the only sound Andy's soft babbling. Nick looked torn, caught between the duty of his job and the weight of his family's disapproval. Nick, Lily said finally, her voice trembling. You need to decide what kind of man you want to be, because right now, I don't even recognize you. Nick met her gaze but said nothing. Henry turned and walked out of the room, his mind already working on the next steps. One night, Henry woke with a start, his senses prickling. The sound had been faint, scratching maybe, but it had set his nerves on edge. He lay in the dark, straining to hear more, but the house had gone silent. Probably just the wind, he thought, or his imagination. Rolling over, he pulled the blanket tighter around him. But sleep refused to return. His throat felt dry, and his restless thoughts made the bed feel too small. With a soft groan, Henry sat up and shuffled toward the kitchen to fetch a drink. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of its old bones. As he flicked on the light, he froze mid-step. Tracks. Large, unmistakable tracks, smeared across the wooden floor near the staircase. His heart pounded as he stared at them, his mind racing. These weren't Max's tracks. The old dog had been banished to the barn during the visit at Lily's insistence. No, these tracks belonged to her. The Lynx, Henry muttered under his breath, his pulse quickening. How the hell had she gotten in? The tracks led toward the attic stairs where the hatch was slightly ajar. Henry cursed under his breath, remembering that he'd left the roof door open earlier in the week to air out the attic. He hadn't even considered that an animal might find its way inside. His stomach tightened as he followed the tracks. But halfway there, a soft, unmistakable sound stopped him cold. Hissing. The sound was faint, almost like a whisper, but it came from Andy's room. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he crept down the hallway. The door to Andy's room was ajar and moonlight spilled inside, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Peering through the crack, his blood ran cold. The Lynx was there, crouched by the crib. Her body was taut, her glowing amber eyes locked onto him in the dim light. Easy now, Henry whispered, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. He mentally cursed himself for coming unarmed. Not that he'd ever fire a gun with Andy so close, but still, he felt exposed. It's all right, girl. Just leave him be. The Lynx hissed softly, her ears twitching. She didn't move, her gaze shifting briefly to the floor beneath the crib. Then Henry heard it. A faint, slithering sound. His breath hitched as the noise became clearer. A soft, rhythmic scraping, almost imperceptible. Something was moving beneath the floorboards. Henry reached for the light switch, his fingers trembling. The bulb flickered on, illuminating the room. There, just beneath the crib, a glint of scales disappeared into a crack between the floorboards. A snake. Dad, what's going on? Henry turned to see Lily standing in the doorway, her face pale with worry. Stay back, he warned, pointing toward the floor. There's a snake under the house. Lily's eyes widened in panic. A snake? Her gaze darted to the crib, where Andy stirred, his tiny fists clenched in sleep. Then she saw the Lynx. Her face twisted in fear, and without thinking she rushed into the room, scooping Andy into her arms. The baby let out a startled cry, his wails cutting through the tension like a knife. Nick barreled into the room moments later, a rifle clutched tightly in his hands. His eyes went straight to the Lynx, his expression darkening. "Get back!" he shouted, raising the rifle. "Don't shoot!" Henry barked, stepping between Nick and the Lynx. "She nearly attacked my son," Nick snapped, his finger hovering over the trigger. "No, she saved him," Henry said firmly, his voice brooking no argument. Nick froze, his eyes narrowing. "What?" Henry gestured to the floor. "There's a snake under the house. She was protecting him. Look, her eyes weren't on Andy. They were on the floor." Nick blinked, his grip on the rifle faltering. "A snake?" "Yes," Henry said, his voice sharp. "And if she hadn't been here, who knows what might have happened? That snake could have gotten to the crib before any of us knew it was there." Lily clutched Andy tighter, her face ashen. "Oh my God," she whispered. "I heard something earlier, but I thought it was just the house settling." Nick lowered the rifle slowly, his expression conflicted. "But why would she?" "She's a mother," Henry interrupted. "Maybe she saw a threat and acted on instinct. Wild animals aren't mindless, Nick. They understand more than we give them credit for." The lynx, still crouched by the crib, hissed softly, her eyes darting between the humans and the floor. Henry raised his hands in a calming gesture. "All right, girl," he said gently. "You've done your part. Let's get you out of here now." Henry opened the window wider, and after a moment's hesitation, the lynx leapt gracefully onto the sill. She paused, her amber eyes meeting Henry's one last time before she slipped into the night, her shadow blending seamlessly with the darkness. The room fell silent save for Andy's soft cries. Lily rocked her son gently, her voice shaking. "I can't believe this. A lynx saving a baby from a snake. It sounds impossible." "It's not," Henry said, his tone heavy. "Wild animals know their territory. She's been watching us, probably even watching Andy. Maybe she saw herself as part of this, in her own way." The moon hung low in the sky as Henry and Nick knelt on the creaking floorboards, prying them up one by one. Their flashlights cast long, jittering shadows across the room, and the quiet was heavy with anticipation. "Careful," Henry warned, his voice low. His fingers gripped the crowbar tightly, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool night air. "We don't know how many we're dealing with." Nick swallowed hard, his usual confidence shaken. "Snakes," he muttered. "Why did it have to be snakes?" With a groan of wood, Henry lifted another board, and the smell hit them. A faint but sour, earthy scent that spoke of something living and hidden. "What the hell?" Nick whispered, angling his flashlight downward. A tangled mass of snakes writhed below, their dark, glossy scales glinting in the beam. Coiled together in the root cellar beneath the house, they shifted restlessly, their forked tongues flickering in the air. Among them, Henry spotted several venomous species, copperheads, rattlesnakes, and others he didn't immediately recognize. Henry's jaw tightened. "A nest! A damned nest!" Nick's face drained of color. "How long do you think they've been here?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Months. Maybe longer," Henry replied, shaking his head in disbelief. "And I never noticed. I never even thought to check." "So that's how she's been getting in," Henry muttered, a faint, almost proud smile tugging at his lips. "Smart girl." Nick exhaled shakily, his flashlight beam darting nervously across the writhing nest below. "What now?" "Now," Henry said grimly, "we clear them out." The rest of the night was spent battling the unwelcome invaders. Henry worked with steady determination, his movements careful but efficient. Nick, despite his earlier hesitation, proved surprisingly helpful, his fear tempered by urgency. Together they used long-handled tools to remove the snakes, depositing them far from the house into the dense forest. By dawn, the root cellar was cleared, the floorboards replaced, and the hole in the foundation sealed tightly. The once ominous silence of the house now felt comforting, a stillness earned after a long and grueling night. The family gathered around the kitchen table, mugs of steaming tea warming their hands. The exhaustion was evident in their faces, but so was relief. "She's been keeping watch all this time," Lily said, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, awed. "Coming into the house, guarding Andy. It's like she knew." Nick leaned back in his chair, shaking his head in disbelief. "And I was ready to shoot her," he admitted, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "What an animal." "She's not just any animal," Henry said, his tone thoughtful. "She remembered what I did for her, and her cub. Guess this was her way of paying me back." Lily smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "You saved her baby, and she saved ours. It's incredible." Nick looked down at his mug, his brow furrowed. "I never thought I'd say this," he said slowly, "but I think I misjudged her. Misjudged this whole place." Henry's sharp gaze softened slightly, though his voice retained its edge. "This forest isn't just a place, Nick. It's alive. It has a balance, a rhythm, and everything here has its part to play. Even the lynx." He paused, his weathered hands wrapped around his mug. "Animals understand more than we give them credit for. They can't talk, but they know how to show gratitude, and they know how to protect what's theirs. Nick nodded slowly, the weight of Henry's words sinking in. A few weeks later, the town hall was packed. The wooden chairs, most of them older than the people sitting in them, creaked under the weight of the gathered community. A faint hum of chatter filled the air as locals discussed what they thought was coming. Some were excited about the promised announcements of progress and new opportunities. Others were wary, their brows furrowed in quiet concern. Nick stood backstage tugging at his tie, his palms were damp, his heart racing. He glanced over at Henry, who stood nearby, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You sure about this?" Henry asked, his voice low. Nick nodded, though his throat was dry. "I have to be." Henry gave a short nod of approval. "Good, because if you try to sell them on that company's lies, you're going to have more than me to answer to." Nick managed a shaky smile. "Thanks for the vote of confidence, Henry." "Confidence comes after action," Henry replied. "Go do the right thing." As Nick stepped onto the podium, the chatter in the room quieted to a hush. The bright overhead lights made the audience appear as a blur of faces, though he recognized a few. Farmers, shop owners, even the old vet who'd once told Henry to put the Lynx down. He adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat, glancing down at his prepared notes. They felt heavy in his hand, like a symbol of everything his company wanted him to say. Promises of wealth, assurances of progress, lies. Nick set the papers aside. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "Thank you for coming tonight. I know you've been hearing a lot of talk about big plans for this area. New developments, new opportunities, promises of prosperity." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "And I know many of you have questions about what this will mean for you, for your families, for this town." Nick hesitated, then leaned closer to the microphone. "I had questions too. Questions that my company hasn't answered, honestly." The room grew still, the weight of his words sinking in. Nick continued, his voice stronger now. "I was sent here to convince you that this forest, your forest, is dying, that the animals are gone and the land is wasted, that the only way forward is to tear it all down and replace it with something new. They told me to promise you wealth and opportunity, but at what cost?" In the back of the room, Henry's eyes narrowed, a glimmer of pride breaking through his otherwise stern expression. Nick pressed on, ignoring the whispered confusion spreading through the audience. "What they didn't tell you is the truth. This forest isn't dying. It's alive, it's thriving, and it's our responsibility to protect it, not destroy it." A hand shot up in the audience. It was old Mr. Walker who owned the feed store. "You're saying your company lied to us?" Nick met his gaze. "Yes, they lied to me too." The room erupted into murmurs, a few voices rising in frustration. Nick raised his hands, calling for calm. "I'm not here to defend them. I'm here to tell you what I've seen. I've walked this forest. I've seen the wildlife, the lynxes, the deer, the birds that nest in its trees. This place is more than just land. It's a living, breathing part of this community." "And what about the money?" another voice called out. "We're struggling as it is. They're offering jobs, payouts. How do we turn that down?" Nick's jaw tightened. He'd anticipated this question. "I understand. I really do. But what they're offering isn't what it seems. The jobs will be temporary, the payouts small compared to the wealth they'll extract from the land. And when they're done, we'll be left with nothing but scars on the earth." He paused, his voice softening. "I've seen what this forest can do. I've seen how it protects its own. My own son, Andy, was saved by this forest, by an animal I once thought was a threat. That lynx risked her life to keep him safe, and in doing so, she reminded me of something I'd forgotten. This isn't just a forest. It's home. To the animals, to the people who live here, and to the generations that will come after us." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Lily, sitting near the front with Andy in her lap, wiped a tear from her cheek. She glanced back at Henry, who gave her a small nod of reassurance. Nick's expression hardened, determination replacing his earlier nerves. So tonight, I'm not here to sell you on the company's plans. I'm here to stand with you, to fight for this forest, for your land, your homes, your future. I've already sent a letter to the commission, resigning from my position. Gasps rippled through the audience. Nick took a breath, his voice steady. I'm asking you to join me, to protect what's ours before it's too late. The room erupted into applause, a wave of energy coursing through the crowd. Henry stepped forward, clapping firmly, his face unreadable but his approval clear. You did good, Nick, he said quietly as he approached the podium. Real good. Nick looked at him, relief washing over his face. Thanks, Henry. I couldn't have done it without you. For the company, it was nothing short of a disaster. Nick's speech had rippled through the community like wildfire. By the next morning, nearly every household in town knew the truth. The promises of wealth and progress were nothing but smoke and mirrors, a ruse to strip the forest of its resources and leave it barren. A few days later, the train's whistle echoed across the hills, a sharp cry that seemed to carry away the laughter, warmth, and chaos that had filled Henry's house these past few weeks. He stood on the porch, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching the train as it grew smaller and smaller, the rising steam blending into the hazy blue sky. Lily had leaned out of the window, waving until the last possible moment, Andy giggling in her arms, too young to understand goodbyes. Nick had given a small, almost shy wave, his face a mix of gratitude and lingering guilt. Henry waved back until they were out of sight, the sound of the train fading into the distance. He let his hand drop, the silence around him suddenly heavy. Lily had begged him to move closer. You don't have to be alone, Dad, she said the night before they left. Andy needs his grandpa, and you need people around. It's too quiet out here. But Henry had only smiled, shaking his head. My life's here, Lil. Always has been. This place. It's got too many memories to leave behind. Your mom's here, in every corner of this house, in the trees, the stream, the air itself. And now I've got something else too. She'd given him a long, searching look, tears glistening in her eyes, but she hadn't pressed him further. She knew him well enough to understand. Now, as he turned to head back inside, Henry paused. A flicker of movement caught his eye from the edge of the yard where the bushes met the forest. He squinted, and there they were, two tufted ears poking out from the leaves, followed by a familiar pair of amber eyes. The Lynx. Henry smiled, his heart lifting despite the ache of the goodbye. You're still watching, aren't you? He murmured. The Lynx didn't move for a moment, her gaze steady and unblinking. Then, with a slow blink of her own, she flicked her tail once, a silent acknowledgement, before slipping into the underbrush, her tawny coat blending seamlessly with the shadows. Henry chuckled softly, shaking his head. You've got a way of showing up just when I need you, he said to the empty yard. He turned and stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards under his boots welcoming him home. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't empty. Not really. As he filled the kettle and set it on the stove, Henry glanced out the window toward the forest. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Somewhere out there, he knew, the Lynx was moving, watching, living her wild and untamed life. Nope, I'm not going anywhere, Henry said aloud, his voice firm and steady. Not while I've got protectors like you around. The kettle began to whistle, its shrill cry filling the kitchen. Henry poured himself a cup of tea, settling into his favourite chair by the window. He stared out at the forest, a faint smile on his face. The fight to protect this land wasn't over. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt, but Henry wasn't worried. He had allies now, both human and wild, and as long as he had the forest, he had a reason to stay. The Lynx had taught him something profound. Even in the most untamed corners of the world, There was connection, understanding, and loyalty. And that was something worth fighting for.